The grand ballroom glittered with gold chandeliers, while Elizabeth walked in with shoes patched at the edges. Alexander laughed. Did she steal those from a beggar? Victoria smirked. No, they're worse than rags. Elizabeth lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning but her spirit unbroken. Margaret whispered, "Hold your head high, my child." Charles barked, "Do not disgrace this house with such filth." The crowd's cruel laughter echoed, slicing through Elizabeth like knives. Thomas, standing near the servants, clenched his fists but said nothing. The music faltered as eyes devoured her humiliation. Alexander leaned closer to his friends, sneering. She is proof that poverty reeks even when dressed for wealth. Elizabeth's chest tightened, but her silence spoke louder than her shame. The violins tried to restart, but whispers lingered. Victoria said, "Even the floor suffers her steps." Elizabeth forced herself to move deeper into the hall, every gaze piercing like a dagger. Margaret pressed her hands together, whispering prayers only she could hear. Charles exhaled sharply, muttering, "Weakness stains everything." Alexander clinked his glass, raising it high. "To those who think they belong," he jeered, his friends laughing louder. Thomas shifted uneasily, torn between duty and anger. Elizabeth's throat ached, but she lifted her chin a fraction, her silence screaming louder than their mockery. The laughter spread like wildfire, igniting every corner of the hall. Victoria leaned closer to Alexander, whispering, "She should have stayed in the servants' wing." Charles' glare deepened as he snapped at a musician. "Play louder. Silence this disgrace." Elizabeth's shoes scraped faintly, echoing against the marble. Thomas whispered under his breath, "Cruelty wears silk." Margaret held her breath, knowing words would only fan the fire. Elizabeth fought the urge to flee, her pulse racing in her ears, her body rigid as a statue. The orchestra swelled, but the cruelty pierced louder. Alexander raised his voice above the strings, "Let us celebrate poverty's fashion." Glasses clinked, and laughter erupted again. Elizabeth's breath shook, her hands trembling as she clutched the sides of her dress. Margaret's whisper came faint and desperate, "Endure, child." Charles' jaw tightened, his pride battling the shame of whispers about his house. Thomas turned slightly, his eyes searching for escape, but his feet refused to move. Elizabeth's silence became the fragile shield against their storm. Elizabeth's shoes caught the chandelier's glare as she took another step forward. Victoria clapped mockingly, "Bravo, the beggar walks." The crowd erupted once more. Margaret closed her eyes, lips moving in prayer. Charles growled low, "Enough." His voice silenced the hall for a moment. Alexander's smirk faltered but quickly returned. Thomas watched, breath heavy, his fists trembling harder. Elizabeth's chest rose with a deep, steady breath. The silence before the next cruelty felt like the edge of a blade, ready to cut deeper. The ballroom's cruelty echoed long after, but Elizabeth found silence in the servants' corridor. Margaret touched her daughter's arm and said, "Their gold cannot weigh more than your dignity." Elizabeth whispered, "But their eyes burned through me." Thomas passed quietly, pretending to polish a brass rail while listening. His heart ached, but he knew speaking would cost him his post. Margaret's gaze carried unspoken strength. "Silence does not mean defeat," she said softly. Elizabeth breathed slowly, her shoulders trembling as she struggled to believe. The air smelled of wax and stone, far from the chandelier's perfume, yet safer than the hall. Margaret guided Elizabeth to a small wooden bench, her hands rough with labor yet tender. Elizabeth whispered, "Why must they despise me for shoes?" Margaret's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady, "Because they fear what they cannot control." Elizabeth looked down, her patched shoes resting on cold stone. "Then I am nothing to them," she said bitterly. Margaret clasped her hands tighter, whispering, "No child of mine is nothing." Thomas glanced once before lowering his head quickly, pretending to busy himself. The faint echo of laughter from the ballroom reminded them that cruelty lingered even in silence. Elizabeth rested her forehead against her palms, breath shaky. Margaret bent beside her and whispered, "The poor carry wounds unseen by the rich." Elizabeth lifted her head, her voice strained. I carry them openly. Margaret's lips trembled, then steadied. Your worth does not come from silk. Elizabeth swallowed hard, tears gathering. Then why does the world laugh? Margaret's silence became an answer heavier than words. Thomas moved quietly down the hall, his shoulders hunched as though carrying the weight of her shame himself. The distant hum of violins seeped through the walls, mocking them with beauty not meant for them. The silence stretched until Elizabeth spoke again. I saw pride in their eyes when they broke me. Margaret's voice hardened with quiet fire. That pride is weakness painted gold. Elizabeth blinked, startled at the edge in her mother's tone. Margaret clasped her daughter's hand, rough fingers against trembling skin. Do not bow lower for their laughter, she said. Thomas paused at the end of the corridor, turning slightly before slipping back into the servants' passage. Elizabeth nodded faintly, though doubt still clouded her eyes. The lantern flame flickered, throwing long shadows across the stone walls like scars that refused to fade. Margaret stood slowly, her back bent yet her spirit unbroken. She whispered, You are not the shame of this house, Elizabeth, they are. Elizabeth rose, shaky but upright. Her patched shoes tapped softly against stone, the sound small, yet defiant. Then I must learn to carry it, Elizabeth said. Margaret's eyes softened, filled with both pain and pride. Carry it, yes, but never let it bury you. The faint laughter from the ballroom carried faintly down the hall, like a ghost of cruelty refusing to die. Elizabeth inhaled deeply, her chest rising with the fragile strength of a storm yet to come. The next morning, the grand estate shimmered with cold light, but Elizabeth's heart still carried the sting of last night. She walked past the servants with her head lowered. Alexander appeared on the stairs, his silk robe flowing as he sneered. Still parading those rags? Victoria followed, her laughter sharp, shoes like those could ruin marble. Elizabeth clenched her fists, but silence pressed heavier than words. Margaret entered quietly from the kitchen, her hands stained with flour, whispering, Do not break, child. Charles descended behind them, voice cutting through. Disgrace must be hidden, not flaunted. Elizabeth's lips tightened, her gaze falling on the polished portraits hanging along the walls, mocking her invisibility. Elizabeth turned to walk away, but Alexander's voice echoed, Run, little beggar, before the marble rejects you. His laughter drew servants' uneasy smiles, afraid to show pity. Margaret's hands trembled, yet she said, Every wound you give makes her stronger. Victoria tossed her hair, replying, Stronger in misery. Charles halted at the last step, his tone cold. This house has no place for weakness parading as pride. Elizabeth's lips parted as if to speak, but she swallowed the words, her silence heavier than their cruelty. Thomas, carrying a tray, paused in the hallway, his eyes burning with anger, but he lowered them quickly before Charles noticed. Later that day, Elizabeth walked through the garden, trying to breathe away her shame. The roses seemed cruel in their beauty, reminding her of Victoria's laughter. Margaret followed with a basket, whispering, You are worth more than their gold. Elizabeth whispered back, Gold silences the poor. Victoria's voice cut across the path. Even flowers wilt near her rags. Alexander leaned against a marble statue, grinning. The gardener should charge her rent for ruining the view. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, her eyes wet but fiery. Margaret's hand pressed against her daughter's arm, whispering, Hold. Thomas appeared by the hedge, his gaze steady, silently urging her not to bend. Charles appeared at the far end of the garden, his shadow long against the path. Enough of this spectacle, he thundered, his voice sharp as steel. Alexander stepped back, but his smirk lingered. Victoria sighed dramatically. Father, she invites shame with every step. Charles' eyes narrowed at Elizabeth. If you wish to remain under this roof, learn silence and invisibility. Elizabeth's chest rose and fell, words trapped like fire in her throat. Margaret whispered, We endure, but we do not vanish. Charles' glare cut to her, warning her into silence. The roses swayed in the wind, fragile yet unyielding. mirroring Elizabeth's trembling stance. That evening, Elizabeth sat alone near the servants' quarters, her patched shoes resting against worn stone. The echo of laughter haunted her ears. She whispered, "How many times must I burn before I turn to ash?" Margaret sat beside her, silent for a moment before saying, "Ash feeds roots that grow stronger." Elizabeth turned, eyes red, whispering, "Then I must become fire." Thomas approached with hesitant steps, whispering, "Even fire is feared when it shines too bright." Their eyes met, silent understanding binding them. From the mansion windows above, Victoria's silhouette lingered, watching with cold curiosity. The storm broke that night, rain hammering against the mansion's tall windows. Elizabeth wandered the dim corridor, her patched shoes leaving faint echoes. A draft pushed open a door to the gallery, a place she had never dared to enter. She stepped inside, her breath catching at the portraits lined in gold. The candlelight flickered over faces of wealth, each painted to perfection. Yet one portrait stood in shadow, its frame covered with dust. Elizabeth whispered, "Why is this one hidden?" Margaret entered slowly, carrying a candle, her eyes tightening with fear. "Because it tells a truth no one dares to speak," she said. Elizabeth brushed dust from the frame, revealing a face startlingly familiar. The painted girl's eyes mirrored her own. Elizabeth gasped, whispering, "She looks like me." Margaret's voice cracked, "Because she is blood of the same house." Elizabeth turned sharply, confusion tightening her chest. Then, "Who is she?" Margaret lowered her gaze, whispering, "The daughter they cast away, the one they tried to erase." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she touched the cracked paint. The storm outside roared, rattling the glass, as if the world itself demanded the secret to break free. The door slammed open, and Charles stormed in, his eyes blazing. "What are you doing here?" he roared. Elizabeth stepped back, but the uncovered portrait stood like a wound revealed. Margaret's voice shook. "The truth cannot be buried forever." Charles' face twisted, his hand trembling with fury. "That girl was never meant to exist." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "Who is she?" His silence became more terrifying than his rage. Finally, his words cut like steel. "She is your sister, Edward's twin, erased to protect the family name." Elizabeth staggered, her knees weak as the storm thundered in agreement. Elizabeth's voice trembled. "You erased your own blood?" Charles' eyes narrowed. She was a mistake, born of betrayal. Margaret stepped forward, her voice sharp for the first time. "A child is never a mistake." Charles glared at her, veins rising in his neck. "Silence, woman." Elizabeth's chest rose sharply, her breath ragged. "And what of Edward?" she demanded. Charles' gaze hardened, his silence revealing the truth Margaret already knew. "Edward lives," Margaret whispered, "but hidden, cast out like this portrait." Elizabeth's tears spilled freely now, her pain mingling with rage as lightning split the sky. The gallery shook under the storm's fury as Elizabeth's voice rose above the thunder. "You cannot erase us." Charles slammed his fist against the wall, shouting, "You are nothing without this house." Margaret moved between them, whispering, "Truth cannot be chained." At that moment, the doors creaked open, and Edward stepped from the shadows, his face a mirror of the forgotten portrait. His eyes burned with years of rejection. "You tried to forget me," Edward said coldly, "but I am the proof you failed." Elizabeth gasped, her trembling hand reaching toward him as the storm howled like a witness. The thunder rumbled as Edward stepped fully into the gallery, his eyes locking on Charles with burning fury. "You erased me, yet I live," Edward said, his voice trembling with restrained rage. Elizabeth whispered, "Brother." Charles' face twisted in denial, his voice sharp, "You are no son of mine." Margaret moved closer to Edward, her voice steady. "Blood speaks louder than denial." Alexander burst in, laughing bitterly. "Another beggar claims kinship?" Victoria followed, smirking. "How many siblings must crawl from shadows?" Elizabeth's voice rose, her anger breaking. "No, truth crawls where lies are buried." The storm rattled the glass like applause for rebellion. Edward stepped forward, voice cracking with years of bitterness. You left me to rot while you feasted. Charles raised his hand, barking, You were born of shame. Elizabeth snapped, her voice sharp. No, he was born of you. Alexander clapped slowly, mockingly. A family reunion in rags. Victoria's laugh rang like broken glass. Margaret's voice cut through, trembling but firm. A father who denies his blood condemns himself. Edward's fists clenched, his voice steadying. I am not here to beg for place. I am here to claim my truth. Lightning split the window panes, shadows carving harsh lines across their faces. Elizabeth moved to Edward's side, her patched shoes scraping stone. If he is cast out, then so am I, she declared, voice breaking but strong. Charles' face turned crimson. Ungrateful child. Alexander sneered. She would rather starve than dine with us. Victoria mocked. How noble, poverty as a crown. Edward stepped closer, glaring at Charles. You hid me because I remind you of your sins. Margaret's voice cracked. Enough. Children do not bear their parents' shame. Charles trembled, torn between rage and fear, but silence revealed his guilt. The storm outside cracked louder, as if judging his weakness. Charles roared. This house belongs to me, not to bastards or beggars. Edward's eyes blazed. Then your house is built on lies. Elizabeth cried, You chained us to shame, but truth is free. Alexander's voice cut with venom. Then leave and rot. Margaret stepped forward, her wrinkled hands trembling but firm. This is not your house, Charles. It is a prison built on fear. Charles' eyes widened at her defiance, his power cracking. Edward's voice echoed, You cannot bury us. We are your blood. The lightning crashed, shattering a window, wind howling like judgment itself. The storm howled louder as silence fell within. Charles' chest heaved, his authority shattered. Edward whispered, You will remember me, even in your last breath. Elizabeth added, her voice like steel, and you will never erase us again. Alexander scoffed, empty words from empty pockets. Victoria smirked, though her eyes flickered uneasily. Margaret's voice broke, This truth will outlive your wealth, Charles. He turned away, shoulders heavy with the weight of his sins, but his silence was his confession. Edward and Elizabeth stood side by side, no longer invisible. The thunder's roar sealed their defiance as destiny shifted. The storm cleared by morning, leaving broken glass across the gallery floor. Elizabeth and Edward stood together, their reflections fractured in the shards. Margaret whispered, Truth has been spoken. It cannot be unsaid. Charles entered slowly, his posture bent, the weight of silence heavy on his shoulders. Alexander muttered bitterly, This house has been poisoned. Victoria smirked faintly, though unease lingered in her eyes. Elizabeth's voice was quiet but unyielding. It is not poison, it is justice. Edward's gaze followed Charles, his voice sharp. You cannot look away forever. The house was no longer filled with laughter, but with echoes of reckoning. Elizabeth and Edward walked through the corridor, servants pausing to stare in silence. Whispers stirred, no longer about humiliation, but about hidden blood revealed. Margaret carried a folded cloth, her face tired yet proud. Edward murmured, They look at me as if I crawled from graves. Elizabeth replied, No, as if you returned from exile. Charles' shadow fell across the corridor as he followed, his steps heavy with shame. Alexander muttered behind them, You disgrace us in daylight. Margaret stopped, turning to him with sharp eyes. Light only burns those who hide in darkness. Alexander's smirk faltered under her words. In the dining hall, the long polished table sat untouched. Elizabeth's voice trembled as she said, This place feeds wealth but starves truth. Edward's jaw tightened. I will not beg to sit here. Charles lowered himself into the head chair, his hand shaking as he gripped the armrest. You speak rebellion, he muttered. Margaret stood behind her children, her words clear. They speak survival. Alexander poured wine carelessly, mocking, Survival tastes bitter. Victoria swirled her glass, whispering, And truth leaves stains. Elizabeth stepped closer to Edward, her tone sharper. Then let the stains remain until they see the truth on every wall. Charles rose suddenly, his face pale, but eyes burning. If you defy me, then leave this house forever. Elizabeth's voice shook. I have already lived without its love. Edward stepped forward steady. And I never had its shelter. Margaret's lips trembled, but she said firmly, we walk with dignity, not chains. Alexander smirked. Good riddance. Victoria's eyes flickered uneasily, watching Elizabeth's defiance. Charles's hand trembled as he slammed the table, but the sound no longer silenced them. Elizabeth's chin lifted higher, her patched shoes pressing firmly against marble, proof that humiliation no longer bent her. The doors of the mansion opened, sunlight pouring over Elizabeth, Edward, and Margaret as they stepped outside. Their breaths were heavy, but their steps steady. Elizabeth whispered, we carry truth now, not shame. Edward's jaw softened, his voice steady. And truth is heavier than gold. Margaret touched both their arms, whispering, yet it frees us. Behind them, Charles stood in the doorway, shadowed, his empire crumbling in silence. Alexander and Victoria remained at his side, their laughter gone, replaced by unease. The gates loomed ahead, not as prison bars but as a path toward destiny. The sun climbed higher as Elizabeth, Edward, and Margaret walked past the iron gates. The village watched from a distance, whispers trailing their steps. Edward murmured, they look at us as if we are strangers. Elizabeth answered softly, we are no longer strangers to ourselves. Margaret's voice carried quiet strength. Names can be stolen, but blood cannot. Behind them, the mansion's tall windows gleamed, but inside its walls echoed with silence. Charles stood motionless at the door, a king without a crown, his empire hollowed by truth. The air felt different now, lighter, though the road ahead remained uncertain. Elizabeth paused at the road's edge, turning once more toward the house that had mocked her shoes and silenced her voice. They laughed, she whispered, but now they must remember. Edward's jaw clenched. They will remember because I stand before them. Margaret laid a hand on each of their arms, whispering, do not carry their cruelty with you, carry only the truth. The wind rustled through the trees, scattering petals across the road like fragile symbols of renewal. Behind the walls, Alexander and Victoria peered through glass, their faces pale, no laughter left to shield them from what remained. In the gallery, the forgotten portrait remained uncovered. The girl's painted eyes glowed in the pale daylight, watching silently as dust drifted across the room. Charles entered alone, his footsteps heavy. He stood before the portrait, his lips trembling as he whispered, I could not erase you. His hands shook, but he dared not touch the frame. His reflection in the cracked glass mocked his once unshaken pride. Outside, the laughter of servants no longer echoed. Only the weight of truth filled the air. The portrait was no longer forgotten. It was a witness to a legacy undone. Elizabeth and Edward walked down the path leading into the village, Margaret between them. Villagers stepped aside, some bowing heads in respect, others whispering with awe. Elizabeth's patched shoes struck the stones with steady rhythm, no longer symbols of shame but of endurance. Edward's voice carried firm conviction. They mocked us, but we endure. Margaret's eyes filled with quiet pride. Endurance is the crown they can never strip. The bells from the chapel tolled faintly in the distance, echoing like a call to rebirth. The road curved ahead, endless yet inviting, as their steps carried them into an uncertain but free tomorrow. That night, the storm was gone, but the mansion windows flickered with uneasy candlelight. Inside the gallery, the portrait's eyes seemed alive in the silence. Outside, Elizabeth whispered to Edward, we are not forgotten. Edward nodded, his voice firm. We are the echo they will never silence. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering, the echo is stronger than gold. The moonlight fell across their faces, silvering their scars into symbols of survival. Far away, laughter did not follow them anymore. Only the sound of their footsteps on the road remained, carrying a final truth. Mockery fades, but memory endures forever.